great to be back again with Fang and the International Relations Special Interest Group. Last time I was here to talk about the Russia and the global energy transition, and what a transition! It's a different world. So I'm here to talk, give you an update on the war in Ukraine. Hardly a pleasant topic, certainly an important topic as our soap opera of a world turns into all kinds of strange places and regrettably violent. I've got quite a slide deck here, folks, so I'm going to go as fast as I can. So, on February 24th of this year, 2022, after a long buildup of military forces and intensifying dialogue, Russia invaded Ukraine. Kind of for the second time, as really this is in many ways a continuation of 2014, only in a much more profound way. The war, I'll give you a presentation plan here. So I'll give you a quick look at the state of play, if you will, talk a bit about the Red Army legend, or is it a myth? We'll talk about Putin's nuclear saber rattling toward the end. It's a good thing for Q&A. I'll talk about the global impacts on energy, food. I'll talk about the Turkish UN brokered Ukraine grain export corridor, the agreement. We'll look at sanctions on Russian oil, finance, and Western technology exports. We'll talk about the Western nations' allied support. Is it solid or fracturing? So far, holding together for now with very, very strong headwinds and increasing headwinds, let me put it that way. But I want to spend really the majority of the time ultimately on looking at Russia's internal situation in perspective. There's an awful lot of urban legend that passes for fact, and ultimately, if you're in a conflict, knowing yourself is important, but knowing your adversary for who they are and what they are is doubly important. And there's no help in fooling ourselves or looking at the world in a black and white manner. And at the end, we'll talk a bit about off-ramps and the cessation of hostilities, at least the potential therein. So initially, from the Kremlin's point of view, this was a special operation that was to be a short, brief, and successful military venture into Ukraine, essentially to remove the existing government or the government of the day and replace it. Kind of a decapitation, if you will, a political decapitation. Announcements went out to Russian airports in the southwest of Russia that they would be closed, and this was distributed nationally. And I mean, this is a very clear statement of what the expectation was going in on February 24th, that the combat would be over within a week, and then things would return to normal. Well, it didn't work out that way. Firstly, and really most importantly, was Russia's airborne disaster at Hostomel Airport outside of Kiev. And poor intelligence on the Russian side led to an inadequate movement of forces to take that crucial airfield. This was designed to be a high-speed intervention by very professional military forces and was not expected to take long. But ultimately, Russia's intervention at Hostomel failed and led to a cascading failure and gridlock of Russian forces throughout northeastern Ukraine, having invaded from Belarus and from Russia. So long lines of armored forces on narrow roads, not knowing where to go, or just a great deal of confusion as the initial assault failed. I think a good analogy would be, say, the invasion of Normandy. If those German tank divisions had in fact been mobilized and in fact had been in the area awaiting the arrival of Allied forces at Normandy, the latter part of World War II is very likely to have evolved differently than we know now today. It certainly was going to end, but that would have been an enormous defeat to have the Allied forces defeated on the beaches and thrown back to the sea. And the political shock at home would have been enormous. But ultimately, much of the Russian forces, once you got away from the elite airborne, motivation was a serious problem. Soldiers didn't know why. First, they didn't know where they were going to fight as they were preparing, and then they got to Ukraine, and it was a total mystery. It was a shock. Why are we fighting essentially our brothers? What are we doing here? It was just a well-kept secret from certainly the Russian forces themselves about where they were headed. That long pre-war field training of divisions and divisions of personnel in the field in the winter, which I can tell you from experience is grinding for sure. Just getting through winter is a real experience in the countryside of Russia. It was Russia's initial invasion was fought with a peacetime army, primarily contract fighters with no real reserves. Field communications turned out to be abysmal, were almost immediately in collapse, where commanders were actually using their cell phones to communicate with each other. And these were problems that had arisen during the conflict in Georgia, Russia's invasion of Georgia in 2008. And one had good reason to believe that those problems have been solved, but they hadn't. The radios didn't work, or corruption may have been a factor. Effective logistics, without communications. I want to come back to this field communications. The communications on the Ukrainian side were shattered as well. Very quickly, Ukrainian forces were able to access Elon Musk's Starlink network, satellite internet communications, which actually provided better communications tools than the Russians had. And that certainly was not something that was anticipated beforehand. And remember, the Russians did not anticipate that they were going to have a long fight here. Effective logistics, well, logistics weren't going to matter in the war that the special operation that the Kremlin had anticipated. But ultimately, there were serious problems with tanks, as you know. This media is full of pictures of tanks exploding after being hit by personnel-launched missiles or drone-launched missiles. The kind of a legend around Javelin, the MLAWs, and the TB2 drones from Turkey, etc. But the untold story, quite honestly, is the destruction of helicopters on both sides. Both Ukraine and Russia have had enormous losses of helicopters. The Ukrainians have had huge losses. We just don't hear about them so much in the West. The failure rates of cruise missiles on the Russian side was certainly a disappointing discovery. Airborne launched KH-101 missiles, a very poor performance so far. The Navy launched Caliber cruise missiles have had a better record and continue to be used. And just for those that are new to the space, Russia has its own global satellite navigation system known as GLONASS. The Chinese have theirs. The Europeans are trying to stand up one as well. It is their equivalent of GPS. And ultimately, the arrival of HIMARS on the battlefield, particularly beginning in July of this year, ended the later phase of Russia's attempt to gain ascendancy on the battlefield by using kind of old school World War II, but retried and retested in Grozny in the 90s of just pounding places with overwhelming quantities of artillery fire. But with the HIMARS precision rockets that it had longer range than Russian artillery and rockets, were able to destroy depots of ammunition behind the lines and left the Russians unable to sustain the fire rate that they had planned for this crushing, pounding of artillery. And now the latest arrival of Iranian drones opens a new door. So again, the exploding tanks. This is something that certainly was new to me, and there may be people on the call that were familiar with it before, but the old tried and true T-72 tank, the backbone of the Warsaw Pact, was poorly designed in that the ammunition was essentially sitting under the crew members rather than behind them. As shown in the graphic here, the Leopard 2 and the Abrams M1 are designed differently, and if the turret is hit, you get damage, but you don't get the explosion that has taken place so often within T-72s, where the ammunition sitting directly underneath without any armor or any way to deflect the blast causes this ammunition to cook off, explode, and blows the turret off. And this kind of a picture has been shown many times. But there are lessons here. Is this certainly the legend of Russian airborne forces and perhaps even the Red Army has been dulled. But I think a closer inspection turns out that it's more complicated. The beginning of this war was a closely run thing. If the Russians had taken the field at Hostomel, we wouldn't be having this conversation today. But if we were having a conversation, it would be quite a different one. But ultimately, there are many lessons that are relevant to the U.S. The U.S. has not been in a peer fight for a very long time. And ultimately, it's clear that the U.S. would need to prioritize Europe over Asia, would need to recognize that it may not be able to hide on future battlefields where internet and phones are able to transmit photos and dialogue essentially in real time. The U.S. Army and Marine Corps are heavily dependent on helicopters, or the V-22 Ospreys are very similar to helicopter and a plane. If the U.S. ends up in a peer conflict, one can anticipate now, through having seen the Russians experience this, that the loss of the helicopter force will present a very different situation to be handled. The U.S. military will need to exercise how to continue a fight in the face of heavy battlefield losses, such as intense losses in helicopters. Again, it's the mobile forces. That's what the Russians were going to depend on in Ukraine for success, and it's what the U.S. military depends on for success in the battlefield as well. In the Indo-Pacific, it's primarily an air and maritime naval theater. It's a different talk for a different day, but there are implications here, particularly when one thinks about drone warfare and missile warfare. But for the Army, it's a limited theater for application of ground forces for maneuver, not much beyond, say, Korea, for example. And that, in fact, maybe defense has perhaps become the dominant form of warfare, challenging the U.S. Army's long preoccupation with the offense. Imagine the politics of a sudden and unexpected, well, imagine if the Iraqis had been had been armed with the kind of shoulder launch or personnel launched missiles that the Ukrainian forces were able to blunt that initial attack at Hostomel and then pick off armored forces in the field in those first weeks, the first days even. So one of my Russian friends, in my 30 years of background in dealing in Russia, both in business and NGO space, I've got a lot of contacts, and this whole thing has been an unpleasant experience in so many ways. But I've been able to maintain some contacts with some good people, and said goodbye to some who kind of took a different path. But the lessons of learning from other people's wars, I am advised that everyone seeks to draw the lessons. No one learns only the right lessons, and even the right lessons are not necessarily implemented in the right way. If you go back to World War II and get into the details and move past the Hollywood aspects of the war, it was a bloody, messy, confused thing. That's war. It often ends up leaving combat as the effective teacher, and the role of that fickle player, luck. What happened at Midway? Was that skill or was that luck? State of forces today. There are no longer forces, Russian forces in northeastern Ukraine. They withdrew within a couple months at the beginning of the war, focusing their effort on seizing finally Mariupol and expanding in the Donbass. Turned out to be a grinding affair, ultimately meeting with a counterattack from Ukrainian forces. This is after the arrival of HIMARS on the field has blunted the impact of Russian artillery, massed artillery, and the rumors, the long-running rumors of Ukrainian counterattack at Kherson meant that the Russians were draining forces out of the northeast Ukraine into the Kherson area where they are today, leaving a poorly supplied, undermotivated forces in northeast Ukraine that were vulnerable to a counterattack. And the Ukrainians was an enormously successful counterattack, a huge shock for Russian forces, a huge shock for Russian power structure, firstly, but also crept into the world of ordinary Russians. This unexpected and very large scale setback. And now, as of today, hearing about the Russian withdrawal forces from Kherson, essentially what I see is Russian forces will withdraw from the west side of the Dnipro River and head up onto and consolidate in the east. The area in the black here is territory that was held by Russia, Crimea, from 2014, restoring essentially Russian control, long historical control over Crimea, going back to the 1780s, and the part of the Donbass where Russian intervention on behalf of and in the name of and with some separatist forces, complex politics of Eastern Ukraine, but ultimately you can see where Russia has expanded. At the end of, toward the end of September, Putin announced that the 4 regions of Ukraine, the seized territory, would now be part of Russia. That turned out to be kind of a mixed bag politically. We could talk about it more. But it certainly opened up, as this offensive cost so much territory and resulted in people on the right, the more nationalist, pro-war types, to question the competence of people in charge in the military, and that crept into the Kremlin itself with questioning the competence of Defense Minister Shoigu. And the next step after Shoigu was Putin. The last couple of weeks of September were a very interesting time in Russia. Just a quick look at refugees. I'm burning more time than I wanted here at the beginning. Unstated, but it's a fact of the matter. A great number of refugees also went to Russia, although the media will give you what occurred with Poland and the spectacular success of Polish hosting a huge number of Ukrainian refugees. It was impressive, to say the least. The United States has taken a little over 100,000 refugees so far. It'll be interesting to see whether they are actually invited to stay. As the war turned in Ukraine's favor, many of those refugees who were abroad or living elsewhere in Ukraine, they began to return home in rather large numbers in this latest missile campaign by the Russians against power, heat, and water infrastructure. Is really, as winter comes on, is presenting civilian leadership in Ukraine with some real challenges. In fact, they're actually asking people to reconsider returning to the cities, or even consider heading back out if they have relatives elsewhere in Ukraine or in the countryside. And that's really, you know, the latest turn is the arrival of foreign-made drones to the battlefield. The Russians insist that these are made in Russia. Well, this is one of the shortcomings of Russian military, is they've really not done much with drones, and that despite talk of having done so, the experience in the field has made clear what the reality is. These Iranian drones are cheap, around $20,000 a piece. It's low tech. This is not something that you require advanced chips or super advanced Western technology. It's pretty simple, but also effective, as those who have studied the Iranian attack on Abqaiq and Khurais oil facilities in Saudi Arabia in September 2019 will tell you. You can do a lot with some cheap drones these days. Black Sea Grain Initiative. I'm going to spend some time on this because it's actually important to the Ukrainian economy. This is more important to the Ukraine than it is to the much discussed or the starving people abroad, or crisis agriculture, crisis food situation abroad. On July 22nd, through the leadership essentially of President Erdogan of Turkey, along with under the aegis of the United Nations, finally, after a couple months of discussions with the Ukrainians and Russians, established a corridor by which Ukraine could export grain from three ports, excuse me, that the ships going in and ships leaving would be inspected by joint crews of Russian, Turkish, Ukrainian, and UN personnel. They would check for weapons, both inbound and outbound. You have empty ship here in the foreground, you have loaded ship in the background. This has turned out to be a surprisingly successful venture, and it's important for the Ukrainians. You need to export grain to earn money. You need to for the government coffers, you need to export grain because 20% of Ukraine's economy is agriculture. The crop that is being harvested now needs someplace to be stored. You need to empty those filled storages from the previous crop. And it just opens up the door for planting next year, and all the services and all the employment and business activity that goes into supporting agriculture and agribusiness in Ukraine. The three ports There's 4 names here, but essentially these 2 operate under the Odessa. Excuse me, Mykolaiv is a port that the Ukrainians would like to see brought into an extension of the current grain deal, which is up for extension on November 22nd of this year. These 3 ports here, which really provided the majority of Ukrainian grain export capacity previously, are back in operation. And it's first-rate facilities. This particular grain export facility at the Pedenia used to be known as Yuzhny. This is oh, excuse me, Cargill owned facility, state of the art, just a few years old, servicing the largest ships carrying grain. You can see the effect. I'll give you a little perspective. After the Black Sea had been closed to commercial traffic, in part because people are afraid of the war, but they're also afraid of mines. There was an Estonian commercial ship that was apparently sunk after striking a mine. Ship owners don't like to put their crews and cargo in the way of such things. So it was more than, some sort of a embargo. It was just that the commercial realities became untenable, and the Ukrainians needed to find a way to ship their grain, starting initially doing by rail over to even to the Baltic through Poland, slowly building some capacity, but a tiny fraction of what Ukraine was normally sending abroad. But August and September showed real success in exports. Ukraine has a reputation, kind of this image of being a huge wheat producer, and it is, but it's an even bigger corn producer in terms of it's a big time product for Ukraine's space in the global grain trade. So corn has been the leading export coming out, and the corn has really come on in the last decade in Ukraine as a go-to crop. And as something that will continue going forward, as most of the corn growing areas are outside the Russian controlled zone. The Russian controlled zone on the southeast is heavy on the winter wheat side. But things like canola oil, sunflower, Ukraine is essentially the world leader in sunflower oil and meal. Barley is a big deal. There was even a shipload of dried peas. So it's a whole lot more complex than simply a wheat story. And going abroad, you can check this out. There's a UN website, Black Sea Initiative, and you can see ship by ship where they're going and what they're carrying. In fact, most of the cargo is headed to Europe. Much of it is heading to the Middle East, if you include Turkey. Yes, Africa, most of it to Egypt, East Asia. But there is a lot of truth to the Russians saying that that most of this grain is heading toward, it isn't going to Africa and the poor people of the world. There's some, for sure, and a lot. Ultimately, it matters in those markets, but the big flows in terms of tonnage, it's to Europe. You can look at the numbers yourself. Go to the Black Sea Initiative UN website. For grain prices, it was a spike caused by the war. And that, there's one of the impacts of the war breaking out was spiking commodity prices really across the board. And this occurred in a fertile territory of an inflationary environment. And it was during this time that financial markets around the world began to take on the board the idea that there was going to be rising interest rates that would crush demand and would may very well lead to a recession. And so commodity markets sold off. Third quarter was one of the worst quarters in the oil market in history, certainly in the top 10 bad quarters. It's not something that gets written about, but it happened all across the board. What the Russians want in the extension of this grain agreement, There was a hiccup last week. We can talk about that, but it is a hiccup. This grain deal is holding, and the flows continue. But the Russians would like to get something out of it as well, and they would like to see the reopening of this ammonia pipeline from Samara Oblast to Bibdenia. And the UN has proposed that this ammonia gas, which is liquefied in Ukraine, that it be pumped to the Ukrainian border, where U.S. commodities trader Tramo would take title to it and handle it from the rest of the way. This is seems like it may get traction in Kiev. It's not a hard no. They're wanting to trade something. It turns out that Russia's a big player in the ammonia market, and that all of Russia's ammonia trade moves through either Ukraine or European EU ports. So sanction issues, although I don't believe that ammonia is currently sanctioned. So energy, well, I've done a series of talks over the last year. It's been an amazing year. Well before the war broke out in February here, prices for natural gas in Europe had soared into historic heights, essentially 10 times anything that had been seen before. The war broke out, continuing of soaring prices. This particular spike here to the right is as gas flows through the Nord Stream 1 pipeline, increasingly were throttled back, firstly through payment issues. Russians wanted to get paid in rubles, not euros or dollars. Then there were cutting off of the companies that didn't want to pay in those terms. And then a series of kind of turned out to be rather farcical in the end, but complaints from Gazprom about technical problems with turbines, and then oil leaking and control panel, ultimately leading to the Nord Stream 1 shutdown. And Nord Stream 1 carrying over a third of Russia's gas exports into Europe, the real backbone of Russian gas flow into Europe. With Europe having successfully stored gas, essentially filled its storages, it's really kind of an amazing story. The LNG flows into Europe were at capacity and have been really kind of an unexpected success. And I would say in a substantial part because China, for its own reasons, imported only a fraction of the LNG that it had contracted for from the US and sold that back into the international market, and the Europeans bought it. So gas prices have sold off recently. There's this palpable sense of, wow, you know, the crisis is past. But the fact that remains that prices are roughly 10 times what they were just 2 years ago. And next winter, filling those storages for next winter is going to be a huge challenge. One, because current LNG capacity, inflow capacity into Europe is at capacity. But the key here now is that the Russian flows into Europe have been so dramatically scaled back. And much of that gas that's currently in storage in Europe is actually Russian gas that won't be coming next year. As a result of the war, within a couple weeks, March 16th was when this Repower EU plan was produced by the European Union, European Commission. Europe made the decision at this point, ultimately with final approval in May, we are going to end our reliance on Russian gas, all of it. Not just scale it back, but close the door. And the different targets areas were higher LNG imports, and some exotic things like biomethane and green hydrogen. These are tiny things. Green hydrogen doesn't even exist yet in terms as a commodity. These will be filled by either LNG or demand destruction. So 155 billion cubic meters is a lot of gas. It is essentially the equivalent of everything that the U.S. exports via LNG and some. The European Union planned to do this in 2/3 of it in 1 year. The LNG diversification, they would use their collective wallet, to go into the international market and buy LNG. They did. Wind and solar, these are political statements. They're not a factor at this point. Last year was also a terrible year for wind in Europe, something to pay attention to for those interested in energy and renewables going forward. Just a quick look at the infrastructure flowing in. Norway is a crucial supplier to Europe and is now the backbone for supply into Europe. With the Nord Stream 1 shut down, now blown up. I'll cover that in a moment. However, this line through Ukraine still flows, supplying Hungary, Slovakia, into the Czech Republic, and a bit into Austria. This area is still bringing gas in from Russia, and it's very much for the Russians are keeping it open for geopolitical reasons. There's also a large pipeline, double line called Turkish Stream that flows under the Black Sea. One string flows to Turkey, the other string flows north towards Serbia. The Russians would like to continue to supply gas this part of Europe. It's a mixed bag for the Russians, and they continue to focus more and more and more on Turkey. Algeria is a big deal for gas into Europe, but it's a limited thing. LNG is really where it's at. You can see how Russia's supply was already dwindling last fall for the pricing behavior between spot and contract prices. Had some weird effects on the flow of gas itself. But then the war, see the role of Norway, of LNG. And LNG is running at capacity, and there's actually a pretty good buildup of ships off Spain and off of particularly the Netherlands and a bit off the UK. There's just not enough capacity to bring it in. And in fact, prices for landed gas are unusually low around those ports. Spain is still isolated from the rest of Europe for gas, although there are plans now to build more connection to North Europe. For Germany, this is kind of the bellwether story for Europe. Germany is no longer supplying or is receiving gas from Russia. They are no longer receiving gas all through September, and that's been the case through October and the beginning of November. Belgium's not a gas producer, but they do have you have inflows from Netherlands. The Netherlands does have a large gas field that they're in the process of closing down. Poor timing. Yes, some of the pipelines from Norway come through here, but this is very much an LNG story. And before the war, Germany was very dependent on fossil fuels, fuel supplies from Russia. 55% of its gas, around 35% of its oil and oil products, and a big buyer of coal, and trying to shut down those lignite mines in the east and in west. And now, as of October, no gas, no coal, and really scaling back of oil. The effect of the high gas prices has been to really hammer the energy intensive aspects of energy in Western Europe. The fertilizer production has been particularly hurt. Production of ammonia is absolutely dependent on natural gas. There are no options otherwise. So the production has been closed across Europe. resulting in soaring fertilizer prices worldwide. And they're bringing in fertilizer, they're importing it from elsewhere. Now, the fade in prices has allowed for some of the fertilizer plants to reopen, but the longer lead time for the petrochemical side of things, it doesn't look like there's going to be the kind of comeback. It's not as flexible. And for metals, it's definitely not. Coming into the fall, the aluminum industry in Europe was anticipating that half its capacity would be closed permanently. But I think ultimately, we're going to see higher gas prices next year, volatile gas prices for sure over the next 2 to 3 years. And ultimately, I think Europe's energy prices are reset higher permanently, which means a kind of a partial deindustrialization as energy intensive manufacturing goes elsewhere. These LNG supplies going to Europe have been pulled from elsewhere. So across of South Asia, in particular Pakistan, they put out tenders since the war, putting out tenders wanting people to sell them gas. They're not even responding to the tenders. And many contracted cargoes that were meant to go to Pakistan were diverted elsewhere as trading companies decided to pay the penalty to break the contract and to make the huge margin of selling on to Europe. Pakistan has been seriously impacted, power crisis in addition to all the flooding, but a significant power crisis, and this will be a long-running thing. India's natural gas imports have been hurt. Bangladesh, Thailand, Vietnam was on the brink of making major decisions about repowering their power grid, moving away from coal to imported LNG, and now they are stuck with some very, very difficult decisions. Russian natural gas exports on the left, more than half going to the EU via pipeline. Russia is a significant LNG producer as well. These two pipelines to the rest of Europe, much of this is Turkey. China is a small scale thing at this point. I'll touch on it in a moment. Gazprom is the monopoly export provider from Russia for pipeline flows. Novatek is the player in LNG. Gazprom's trying to get into Novatek's LNG business. Gazprom has about half of Russia's domestic supply for natural gas. They don't have a monopoly at home, but they do have a monopoly for exporting abroad by pipeline. As exports fell, the orange line here, as exports fell, Gazprom's domestic production fell essentially in line with it. You can see them filling storage here at home and then falling production. They're not going to be sending it anytime soon to China. This is a map of Russia's natural gas trunk line network. Gas that's headed to Western Europe and to Turkey comes out of Western Siberia. There are no pipelines connecting Russia's traditional reserves of Western Siberia with China. All the development, all the flows planned for heading to China. This Power of Siberia pipeline is anticipated to supply up 38 billion cubic meters a year. The pipeline is now connected to Kovita, a 2 trillion cubic meter reserve. This is what will supply into China. There is now a contract for 10 billion cubic meters per year to come from Sakhalin. The pipeline has not been built for that. There are talks about building a new pipeline in Western Siberia to China, Power Siberia 2. That is years and years and years and years away. It's currently anticipated that the Power Siberia 1 will not really reach full capacity of 38 billion cubic meters until 2027. So for those that have a question, is all that gas going to go to China? No. And with the sanctions, the technology sanctions, essentially broken the back of dreams of Novatek and of Gazprom to develop liquefied natural gas, as the liquefaction core units come from either Japan or from Western Europe or the United States. They are not made currently in Russia. They've yet to figure that technology out. Oil, Russia's a big supplier of oil, and I'm running out of time here. 2021, you could see the effect of EU, how important the EU is, both in terms of a crude oil market for Russia and a crude products, oil products market. The closure of the EU as a market, and more sanctions are due on the 5th of December, and another package that will affect imported crude oil by sea, and another package of sanctions on February 5th, 2023, which will sanction the import of refined products from Russia. The Russians have needed to find new markets, and to a substantial degree they have, India being the big buyer. The Russians have discounted oil because it's a long way. I mean, the Indians didn't buy much Russian oil beforehand because it was so far away, it didn't make economic sense. The logistics costs were prohibitive. However, due to discounts, Russia has supplanted Iraq, and I believe it's Saudi Arabia as one and two suppliers for India, Turkey as well. We can talk about this. Time is now. Diesel is a big deal for the entire world. It's the biggest part of the U.S. refined products crisis. Coming into the election, tremendous concern in the White House about the prices for diesel, the shortfalls of how expensive things were, and oil was released from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, and was, in a lot of ways, was promptly exported, because the problem wasn't with crude. There really was plenty of crude around. The problem was with refining and the availability of refined products. And it turns out that Europe is really dependent, has been dependent on Russia a great deal. Looking here on the right, the European Union looks to need to replace 700,000 barrels a day of diesel. I mean, this is the backbone of transportation, of trucking, and vehicles. Actually, European vehicles are intensively focused on diesel, and they're going to be drawing fuel in from India, from the U.S. Gulf. But currently, what's happening is it shows 410,000 barrels a day coming out of the U.S. Gulf. It's coming out of New York. It's just the way the market works. It's New York. The prices for diesel being established in the New York harbor. Cargoes are flowing. Flowing from New York to Western Europe, and resulting not only in very high prices for diesel, but also extremely low inventories in the Northeast, enough that there's going to be some real concern over the next few months. And the heating fuel being very much an analog of diesel, a cold winter in the Northeast could present some very serious problems. We can talk about the Nord Stream, the sabotage of the Nord Stream pipelines. Big deal starting on the 26th of September. Nord Stream 2. Now, Nord Stream, each Nord Stream 1 is 2 pipes. Nord Stream 2 is 2 pipes. Nord Stream 2 was struck. Nord Stream 1 was struck. It turns out the Nord Stream 2, only one of the lines was destroyed. The other one was undamaged. But ultimately, the Russians have pulled have drawn the gas out of that pressurized but unused pipeline. This happened in international waters. Yes, exclusive economic zone waters of Sweden and Denmark, but in international waters. These were large explosions, essentially of size is something you would experience at a big quarry, a 2.3 and 2.1 on the Richter scale, an explosive load of several hundred kilos, big explosions. These state-of-the-art lines are 1.6 inches thick, of the best steel out there, absolutely state-of-the-art. So an inch, 1.6 inches of steel, and then varied thicknesses of reinforced concrete laid on the steel pipe to make sure the pipe sits on the ground. Why 1.6 inches thick? Well, these pipelines run at over 100 atmospheres, where gas is pressurized in Russia and run all the way through to Germany. There are no compressors under the water. Whoops, let me go back on this. So who had the capability to do this? For me, this is a Russian operation, in part because only one of the lines of Nord Stream 2 was busted. But I will tell you that it's been really bizarre to watch. There's been no meaningful effort to determine the responsibility. The Swedes have gone to investigate, and others have gone to investigate, but nobody's really talking. And the Baltic Sea is heavily patrolled by a number of navies. You can be sure that there are devices laying on the seabed just to track. And my conversations with senior U.S. Navy people, what is striking is, one, they're really not interested in talking about the Nord Stream case itself, other than to say, well, it could be somebody, you know, an offended oligarch, has been put out to me, which it shows a lack of understanding of how things work in Russia. But it's really striking that no one really wants to get to the bottom of what happened, and no one wants to repair it either. So the corrosion, the flood of seawater on the 3 of the 4 strings blown, these pipelines will never come back into use. The Russians will say, well, and others will say that this now gives U.S. control of the European natural gas market via LNG exports. The U.S. doesn't have the capacity to expand flows of LNG to Europe. The increments have really been coming from buying supplies from other people and draining it from elsewhere. My sense is that the Russians are probably one, closing the door on the Germans and slamming the door on the Germans in a way, but also perhaps issuing a warning about the vulnerability of European infrastructure. But ultimately, everyone seems satisfied with the results. So it is what it is. This is a map showing the pipeline network running under the North Sea. I don't care how many ships you have. This is a big place, by and large, mostly shallow water. Certainly vulnerable if somebody wanted to make it so. There have also been people talking about that another aspect of infrastructure are internet cables. Used to be telephone cables. Well, now everything's internet cables, fiber optic cables. Very, very intense, a number of cables lying next to each other in the North Sea certainly would present a challenge for Western Europe. However, the internet is a network, and it was far more resilient to damage than a pipeline damage. So I don't really see this as as really a serious threat in the near term. It's something that's kind of fun to talk about or worry about, but in a practical matter, it's not that serious. Now the gas pipelines, that's more serious. There's no backup there. I want to look at domestic Russia, and I have no time. All right. When you have time, go to Bruegel and take a look at this report. It's a fascinating report that really is required reading for anyone that is looking at the strategic realities now. What's the situation like inside Russia economically? The whole point about sanctions was to defang the Kremlin, to take away the monetary resources that could be used to prosecute the war in Ukraine. Well, because of very high commodity prices, Russia's current account is higher in the first 9 months than it's ever been at any other 9-month period in history. Now, with a recession looming, one can expect these commodity prices to back off, but still, you're going to have some very, very strong current account numbers. Trade with Russia was shocked by sanctions and self-sanctions, companies taking action to not do business with the enemy, so to speak, or starting a war. What the heck's with that? It's very poorly received in the public in Europe, and many companies just walked away from dealing with Russia at all. And there was a shock to goods trade. Russia's ability to import from Europe and elsewhere was severely impacted. And you can see, certainly with the United States, has not been much recovery. But for the rest of the world, there is some recovery, and Turkey actually has filled the gap in a big way. Turkey is exporting more than they ever have before. But on the graphic on the right, and China here on the red, China is taking advantage, but not as much as you might think. It's a complex story for the Chinese. To step back and look at things with some perspective, the import shock was large, but not as large as the pandemic. The current account surplus on the graphic on the left is anticipated to continue next year. Part of what brought the current account surplus was Russians' inability to travel abroad. This this blue services deficit is substantially Russian travel abroad. On the graphic on the right, prices for, really what I want to point out here is that while there's just way too much of a view that Russia is some sort of a gas station in the countryside kind of a thing, it's not. About half of Russia's exports before the war were non-hydrocarbons. Half. The Russian budget, government budget, federal budget, Kremlin, is running negative. You can see the impact of the pandemic in trillions of rubles. But ultimately, the Russian government, Russia as a country, and the Russian government retain a very strong balance sheet. As oil prices decline, here they're pointing to potential increases in gas or oil prices, adding income to the Kremlin. And the Kremlin budget is very much dependent on oil and gas taxes. With, let's say, prices fall, they're going to have to get that money elsewhere. But they've got a tremendous amount of capacity to borrow that other governments don't have. And it actually turns out that the strong ruble has been a big headwind on the central government budget. In terms of banking, around 65% of Russian banking system is disconnected from SWIFT. It means 35% is still connected. the role of the US and EU sanctions together and separately. I mean, basically you're looking at that, maybe 75% of the Russian banking system is sanctioned, but 25% of it's not. So things like energy, agricultural products, fertilizers, medical products, those still are transacted outside the sanctions regime. Inside Russia, the invasion presented a liquidity shock to the central bank, a very big one. The Russian central bank's response was to double interest rates. They have cut those interest rates back to a point that's lower than before the start of the war. So the financial situation in Russia has stabilized considerably. Big seizure of assets, the reserves held abroad. That was one of the big sanctions moves that the Russians did not expect. This modest decline in reserves understates the impact, though, because most preponderant Russia's reserves are preponderantly either in gold or in Chinese yuan. You can do things with Chinese yuan, but it turns out that if you have hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of tons of gold, it turns out there's not much of a market for it. You can't, there's no liquidity to that. So it's essentially metal sitting on the floor in in some warehouse or in a safe. It's something to consider for what value is gold in the modern era. This is an important graphic on the right, though. The ruble still is a common perception that the ruble, which sold off severely as Westerners and Russians sold rubles and tried to move their money outside the country. In fact, the ruble is now substantially stronger than where it was before the war. It has presented the Central Bank of Russia with a serious challenge in terms of how to manage it, but it's also put headwinds on Russia's export economy as their ruble earnings are reduced. It's a curious effect. What you want out of an exchange rate is stability. And Russia's finances have been exceptionally well managed by any measure until the war really put a shock to things. They're still trying to figure out how to get money flowing back into the economy, but generally speaking, the Russian domestic economy, you just don't see that there's a war on. It wasn't until the partial mobilization at the end of September that people really decided that there was a war on. Now, sanctions will have an impact. We'll get to the specifics of it. It turns out that Russia, large countries like China, Japan, Russia, Brazil, the United States, are not really all that dependent on an aggregate sense on international trade. But it's on the technology side that it's the bigger problem, certainly for the Russians, in terms of aircraft and cars, IT. Just because the United States doesn't send, it doesn't have a large export share, for example, or the external share of IT. If you're not able to access those components from abroad, and the Russian chip designers, they did fabless fab work too. Their work was done in Taiwan too. Their chips were manufactured in Taiwan, and they were cut off. So this presents a huge headwind for the Russian military, but also for Russia's IT sector, which didn't get a lot of attention, but it was actually seriously advanced. And it was the largest IT and internet commerce sector in Europe. Companies have left Russia, yes, but an awful lot are either suspended or digging in for the long run. You can see Europe in blue, North American companies, primarily North American European companies, have pulled out, as have Asian Pacific. Japan and Korea very much on board with all of this. But elsewhere, this other, there's an awful lot of companies that are sticking around. I don't see much of a future for them. I'm not sure that it was a good business decision, perhaps in part driven by the fact that they were not able to sell their assets. And it's not easy for a company to walk away from assets, just write it off. But the foreign companies in IT in particular are really going to have an effect going forward. Another image here, the effect of the impact on the left graphic, showing air transportation. Air travel in Russia is going to be severely impacted by the inability to maintain Airbus and Boeing aircraft. That's the deal. And the Russians do not have an easy way around that. That's going to be a huge challenge for them to figure out. Automotive, well, it's a less pleasant thing to go back to, making old school cars, but imports of used vehicles from elsewhere in the world continues, and the prices of those vehicles are getting tremendous prices, very high prices inside Russia today. Looking at the Russian domestic economic, you can see the industrial production, the red graphic. The pandemic had a far greater impact on the Russian economy than the war so far. Leaving aside the specific technology sanctions, that's the deal. It is a modest financial impact. It is a headwind on consumers. Their variety of products that they're able to access is increasingly limited. But this whole summer, it seemed that domestic Russia was kind of floating on some sort of a weird cloud of summer breezes and open fields and fruits and vegetables from the countryside. It was just a very relaxed scene. Certainly one very different from one would find in Ukraine, and a lot different than what most Westerners would anticipate. It wasn't until the partial mobilization toward the end of September that the fear really struck home. So what were people doing? They were looking, what's the Russian public doing? This is polling from September. And yes, you can do polling in Russia. Let's leave the urban legend stuff aside. These guys, Levada Center, they're pros, and they actually went out and did polling to see if they could actually, how to say this, they polled the public on the effectiveness of polling, essentially. I don't know how to say it in a short way. But this is robust data, let me put it that way. And it's interesting that the youth, who are really kind of the most opposed to the war, are not really paying attention to it like older people are. And this is kind of the older person's war, an echo of the Soviet Empire, the Russian Empire, calling back to the old days. When the mobilization was announced, across the board, across every age group, the first response was fear. There were those that were angry, especially the younger ones. The younger ones, plenty of depressed. The daughter of a good friend of mine left for Kazakhstan with her boyfriend. Spent an hour and a half on the phone with this fellow as he went in. Talk about going off the deep end. A very personal experience, horrific for him. But pride in Russia, even with the mobilization, bringing all that fear. How successful is the operation? initially in April and May, the general view was pretty successful, despite what was clear to most observers was a military disaster. It was a very successful PR campaign managed by the Russians, but also kind of a willingness, a willing to not pay attention to this, kind of closing the eyes. And it very much is part of the Russian character with, with the things that are beyond your control. Just deal with what you can control. Your job, your family, your day-to-day in your narrow local world. You can't control politics. But when the mobilization hit, things changed quite significantly. Interesting on the sanctions, and I apologize here for running long. On the sanctions, most Russians see this as a good thing, believe it or not. And I'd say that this is a bit of a warning for the West, in that the longer this conflict goes, that the initial obvious military setbacks and shocks fade, and the longer, the ability to adjust and adapt. In Russia, you're dealing with a population that lived through the 1990s. I was there. Very few people outside the developing world have any idea what that was like. In Europe or in North America, no clue, unless you're a refugee or an immigrant from somewhere recently. No clue. What is going on now is, well, there weren't any wars in the 90s, and that's not a good thing for Russians now, but they are used to hard times, and the deep resilience that's there. You just got to know that it's there. It is an adaptable, creative people. So to let this war go on for a long time is just laden with risks the longer this goes. In the rest of the world, Australia, Japan, US were opposed. Who's to blame? Russians were opposed to the Russian invasion. The Indians are opposed to the invasion, but who's to blame? Interesting. You find this in Turkey as well, Indonesia. And it's not like they're short of information. There is a perspective, and there is a reemergence of what used to be called the non-aligned movement. This is more than just narrow national interest. Maybe India being, taking advantage of cheap oil or something like that. There's more to it than that. Within these countries, large populations are wary of going along, wary of picking one side or the other. They've got a lot of historical reasons not to do that. Polling in the United States. What kind of role does this have in the current election? And what kind of role will it have in 2024? Well, currently, this is a very recent poll, not a survey. People were given 5 things to choose from that concerned them. Russia's invasion of Ukraine was number 9. More so for Democrats, and these are for registered voters. Okay, this is not across the population. These are registered voters. What really blew me away was the role of terrorism still plays in people's minds. We're still in the 90s as a population. Immigration, it's very much a Republican issue, as is drug trafficking. I mean, people are dying in waves in the United States. It's not a foreign policy issue. It's a domestic issue. It's about healthcare. It's about a mental wellness. But you know, and yes, the stuff is coming from abroad. But I'm just really struck by the domestic focus of these foreign policy issues. And I think it's an important takeaway for American politicians going forward. Curiously, within the elites, and certainly within the Kremlin, there are those who are quietly saying on the side that, wow, you know, if we can extend this war to 2024, when Donald Trump comes back, we'll have a friend in the White House and we can do some deals. I think that even if Donald Trump returns to the White House in 2024, Trump is a wild card of the first order. Whether you love him or hate him, he is a wild card. I couldn't tell you what he's going to do next. All I know is it will be the best and the greatest. And on the left, in the progressive world, there's a group of people who would be, and this plays on an old, deep fear inside Russia that, you know, NATO is going to incorporate the old Warsaw Pact and the countries, the republics that used to be part of the Soviet Union, that would be part of NATO. And the fear was, well, they're actually going to come for us next. You know, it's more than just this kind of checkers-minded expansion of NATO. There is this sense on the inside of the threat to national unity. And while, you know, Russia is a multi-ethnic society, it's overwhelmingly Russian. Those progressives, and this is from the U.S. Helsinki Commission, they are really pushing this. Big meeting in June and again in September. They are pushing this idea that Russia empire will be broken up into various ethnic republics. And I will tell you that the result of this will be an ethnic cleansing on the scale that will make the war in Ukraine look like a beach party. I don't get, you know, it's ignorance of the first order that this even gets suggested, and for it to be discussed at rather high levels of the US government is, I would say, really worrisome, but it also plays to the darkest fears of Russian conservatives and reactionaries. So what kind of off-ramps? It's odd that the decision about when to negotiate for a ceasefire has been left to Ukraine. I mean, I can understand from a political perspective why that's attractive, but there are deep, you know, this war is about more than just reviving empire. I'll take you down to this part from Artem Lukin, an international relations professor in Vladivostok. And in his perspective, and I very much see this the same, that the war in Ukraine is a four-part thing, a very complex experience and situation. It's a civil war, a clash of ethno-nationalisms, Russian Empire's attempt to regain its vital province of Ukraine, and Russia's struggle for global power and autonomy. So, you know, this letting this cook is not necessarily in the national interests of the United States or in the overall well-being of the world. It's just very difficult to ask a country which has lost so many people and has been devastated in the East and South to, you know, to just hang it up and talk for peace. But back at the ranch, in the background, the U.S. and Russia do continue quiet talks, or particularly guardrails about how to avoid accidental clashes between forces. Putin's room for maneuver at home is very much limited by domestic politics. The war in Ukraine is very much supported by the right, the ultra-nationalists, if you call it, but certainly the nationalist community across Russia. So think in terms of 15, 20, 25% of the public really think this is a great idea. Another, maybe half the population is supportive in the sense of, well, they supported US forces in Vietnam because, it was kind of they're our guys, but we think this is a foolish war. We want it to end. It was a bad idea. And then there's a side on the left, if you will, on the liberal side, that maybe 25% that were totally opposed, thinks it's catastrophic, and many of those people have left. With the mobilization having achieved maybe 200,000 people, more than 300,000, mostly young and skilled Russians, have left in this second wave of departures. So this is hardly bodes well for the Russian future. And what was not built into many of those indicators that I showed before was that the departure of 200,000 working age men out of the economy is going to have significant effects. And it's just not clearly understood yet what that will be. So thank you for your time and attention. I know this is all run long. I welcome your questions. Thank you.
Wow.
And the slide deck is available on request. So yeah.
So let me see what questions we have. We have some comments, but there are at least one or two questions here. This is Chris. It says, isn't grain a global market? Doesn't the incremental supply in the matter where it's delivered have an impact on global grain prices?
Yes, by and large, that's true. Yeah.
Sorry, I have a printer running in the background. I apologize.
And this, I think this probably refers to the, the supply of grain moving out of Ukraine. Is the preponderant export flow has been to Western Europe and not elsewhere. So if we're talking about economics and the prices of grain, I get it. That's all true. One's got to look at the politics and the PR that's around this, that shapes public opinion and public perception, which is something separate.
Right. So again, as a reminder, if anybody has questions, put them in the comments. A lot of what Charlotte says, the slide deck will be sent tomorrow to everyone online with a Zoom recording link to the call. We'll just go from the top on some of the comments. It says U.S. did not take in 100,000. That was the number announced by Biden as total capacity. Current actual numbers are lower. Again, these are comments. Says a lot of refugees streaming into Russia are actually deportees who were forced by Russian army into Russia by denying them the possibility to leave the combat areas toward Ukraine-controlled territories.
On the let me pause you here for a minute, Chris. On the refugee count here, I'm open to anybody that's got different information. On the final slide, it's got my contact information. If you got something different, something better, I'm open to it. Okay. I just gave you the best effort. I'm not here to pitch anybody's I'm not here to push anybody's argument.
Right.
Can I ask a question?
Well, hold on. Let me read this other question that we have in the comments, and then yeah, absolutely. It says, I know this is unfair, but how does it end?
Oh. Nobody knows. And I'm not gonna mess around and look, there are people that are making bank and political space for themselves by guessing, but nobody knows. It's what is very clear is that the goals of the Kremlin and of where the Russian population sits is very different than that in Ukraine or elsewhere in the world. And Ukraine is very much dependent on weapons supplies, particularly from the United States, which I expect to continue. They are also very dependent on, they're very exposed financially and are in need of $3 to $5 billion a month. And I think closer to the, let's say for discussion's sake, it's 5, that's $60 billion a year. In the current environment, it's so far the United States is carrying almost all the load on all this, both militarily and financially. I just don't see an easy, if it ends, it's a compromise, which means everybody gets something that they want, but they don't get all of what they want, and they have a bitter taste in their mouth. I don't see it happening under the Putin. I see this war continuing for several years at least, at various rates. Things will quiet down now. There's been a lot of chuckling. I'd say mostly, yeah. So the mobilization process inside Russia has been kind of a farce in some ways. It's been left to the individual oblasts by and large. The national structure for registering and moving and giving some training or not, or equipping or not, it's very pell-mell. Some oblasts are providing decent amounts of support, others are not. But the system, I mean, it would be like reviving the draft here in the United States. I mean, I signed up for selective service in 1979, you know, and I think it's still on the books that American men turn 18 have to sign up. If there was a draft put on here in the US that's going to draft 300,000 people, you're going to see some serious chaos. On the scale of what's occurred in Russia, no, it's very much within that environment. But what people are missing is that over time, this could become a relatively effective force in certain aspects of the fight. Right now, they're cannon fodder. A lot of these guys are being thrown into the field without any training, barely equipped at all. But next spring, after the rains and quit and the mud hardens, I suspect that things will be different. A year from now, 18 months from now, yeah. And there's rumblings about a second mobilization coming. There's been kind of a piecemeal martial law rolled out in Russia, again, oblast by oblast, very fragmented approach, but there is a national theme to it. I think a lot of the snickering that has gone on about the performance of Russian forces, and it deservedly is some, certainly the expectations were much higher. The Russians didn't put their entire force in the field, for one, and they will learn, you know. The US has gone to war, you know, after Vietnam, it was Grenada. There was the moving of basically the World War III against the Warsaw Pact forces. As the Cold War ended, that army just got shifted to Saudi Arabia for the Gulf War in 1991 before coming back to the US. And then we fought Iraq after having convinced their military to stand down, right? You know, good move. And then we told them to go home without a job. And Afghanistan. So, you know, I actually think that a peer conflict is going to be an unpleasant wake-up call. It's just not a good thing anyways. But I having lived, worked in Russia for 30 years and having a fair sense of the history, always learning, just don't underestimate. That's don't underestimate that. So that's just me saying.
Somebody said they wanted to, they had a question. I don't know if you posted or not.
Yeah, I had a question. With the American election results coming in, obviously there's not a presidential election until 2 years' time, but obviously Congress, the complexion of Congress could change towards the Republicans, which are dominated by Trump in terms of his ideology and his hold on the party. And bearing in mind his close relationship with Vladimir Putin when he was president, how do you foresee the change in Congress affecting US policy towards the Ukrainian war, particularly in terms of funding it?
Well, I would say the jury's still out on the election, but let's say for discussion's sake, the Republicans end up control of the Congress. That could present a headwind. You know, it is not a vote winner, as that polling data showed. And that's kind of an unfortunate thing, is then the Ukrainians need to be aware of this reality that, you know, for the United States and pretty much for any country, its foreign policy is a reflection of its domestic politics. It's in the domestic environment. The U.S. is already in austerity mode, and that will become more so in the months to come, both in terms of government spending and in the domestic economy. I know there's lots of people talking about big investment programs and the Inflation Reduction Act. You know, a lot of that Inflation Reduction Act is tax credits and investment credits and production credits, and so it's designed to mobilize private money, not public. There already is Washington has begun to lean greater, more firmly on European allies to support the financial aspect. There is other polling showing that the U.S. public is interested and is supportive of Ukraine, and I see the weapons flow unimpeded. It's on the financial side of things, and that's where having, you know, being able to point to European support. As far as the, you know, Trump being a friend of Putin, it has been said, and this is in the context of going to war in Ukraine and threatening to, you know, use nuclear forces, that Trump is said to have, by some said to have stated that, well, Vladimir, we'd use a couple on Moscow. Not that that would happen, but one of the things that's made Trump successful as a businessman is really playing a game of chicken with authorities. I don't see him as a particularly reliable as an anchor, or a, you know, somebody that you could really lean on for support to predictably know where they're going to be on something. It would be a very risky choice by the Kremlin. That's my view.
Let's see. So we've got any chance Ukraine regains Crimea?
No. The Russians. Okay, this is where the negotiating gets really tough. Russians are not going to take extreme measures whatever they might be, nuclear or otherwise, in the Donbass. But Russia will fight for Ukraine or for Crimea. That's not something that's going to be given away, either through negotiations or through conventional combat. I mean, that's the deal. Donbass is different. Crimea. So, and this is actually one of the challenges to setting up any kind of, each side in this war is going to have to give something painful. And what are the Russians going to give that's painful? That's actually the harder thing to work out. That doesn't cause a political breakdown in Moscow. And for anybody that thinks that there's going to be some sort of Gorbachevian liberal progressive that comes to power post Putin, certainly in a post a competitively driven collapse of the Putin regime, is not going to be somebody from the happy left. It's going to be somebody that is from the right and will double down on getting it done, instead of that failed loser guy. And there's plenty of tradition for that. So I just knowing Russians, I don't see it, and I don't see the advantage to Ukraine to take this war to another level. War brings out the extremes in everyone, and in every public, I would say, every population. So I can get why, but I really think at a cooler moment, the majority of Ukrainians would find a way to move on. I don't, in the modern era of warfare, I think the value of the Black Sea fleet and the bases in Crimea, the Sevastopol and all, I think they're considerably devalued. But this is about land, about identity. And in fact, Crimea, I think, means more to the Russians than it does the Ukrainians. I get in trouble for that, I'm sure. Next.
Yeah. So again, I'm not reading all the comments right now. I'm starting
Yeah.
to get through the questions. So it says and some of these questions have comments, but anyway, what will the conflicts likely run consequences for the global energy industry and transition to non-carbon based economies?
I think this sets back the decarbonization essentially a decade. And it's there are still hopes that and there'll be some results from the high prices of energy to encourage investment in renewables. But sadly, I think that this actually causes a reversion just to fossil fuels because of the necessity to deal with energy security today, not tomorrow. So a decade, I think so. And before the war, with the explosion of just a tremendous spike in natural gas prices in Europe before the war, 2021 was a terrible year for wind. And for a modern civilization to base its society on that level of intermittency is a dangerous thing. So if you are going to go down the road of renewables, you also have to have the battery backup, and not batteries for a few hours, but batteries for days and days. And we're not even close to that yet. I mean, we're kind of scratching around the edge. And you look at the EU Repower, Repower EU program. There was some. The first move was get the gas in there, and well, we'll talk about biogas and green hydrogen, and green hydrogen being a big chunk of that. And yet there is no green hydrogen out there. I mean, so it's going to be a decade of very difficult times for the greens, for the renewable world. What I didn't talk about in this was what's happened in the world of coal with the high gas prices, not just in Europe, and with the shortfall in gas supply and the reverting back to coal and recommitting to those lignite mines, not only in Germany, but in Poland, Greece, but in Asia, the effect of soaring coal prices, because the world is going to ship coal to Europe because they're not buying Russian coal. So the total supply of coal available in the world has been reduced significantly. But the prices haven't gone up as high, not as much as gas. So all throughout Asia, the move has been back to coal. And I think Vietnam presents a really important case study, if you will. It's a big economy, a big country population-wise, that is making crucial decisions about how it will power its economy in the next 10, 20 years. And their plan was to go gas and not coal. Well, gas is going to be a problem for at least the next 3 years, maybe a little longer. Ultimately, gas prices will come down, but how much and how long will it take? And we still haven't foreclosed on Russia's LNG flows into the world. This is going to be a real challenge for decarbonization, I'm sorry to say. Because those prices are having an effect here in the US as well. No, well, that's a different talk for a different day. Sorry.
Well, I know we've run longer
Yeah.
than expected. Again, there's some comments in here, and I don't mind. I don't
Yeah.
mean to short shrift anybody, but I want to get to the questions first. So if anybody has any specific, I think this is probably a good time. I was trying to let let our guest speaker talk to the questions. Again, not trying to undervalue all the comments, but anyway.
Yeah, there's some interesting comments here. Oh, excuse me.
I just wanted to ask one last question. Do you foresee one potential outcome of this being Russia's own Velvet Revolution, where Putin could actually unravel and come undone at the hands of his own people?
I do see it as that his future will be determined at home. I don't foresee a Velvet Revolution. I'm disappointed. I mean, basically 30 years of my career have been tied up, have been involved in the late Soviet period and my connections with Russia. It's not the only thing I do, my only, of all those years, but it's been really kind of the biggest. It's really been a great disappointment that Russia has struggled so much to move beyond the imperial mentality. The breakup of the Soviet Union was, this is an echo of that. The war in Ukraine is a consequence of the breakup of the Soviet Union. in part. There is, in Germany, it wasn't until the late 60s, with the emergence of Ostpolitik, that Germany came to grips with the fact that it had lost the war in Europe, that they were responsible for that war, and that they had lost it. And that was more than 20 years after the war. I mean, it's and that was fought to the end on German soil. I really had higher hopes, because I mean, Russia has has what it needs to be a successful and powerful country in all the ways that define power. But this this issue of identity with you know, a space, this idea of who we are, that Russians need to own and redefine that what do we stand for? And the younger generation, those that were born after the breakup of the Union, they have a different view in much of the time, but not all the time. You know, not every person that's 22 years old thinks that this is all a catastrophe and they can't wait to go to Kazakhstan or Georgia. You know, actually, I think if you ran the numbers, most of them are going to stay, and if a draft comes on, they'll go to war. But this is really a catastrophe for. This redefines what's possible for Russia, looking down the road a couple generations even, and what might be in a relative sense, it's a true disaster.
Tatiana has her hands raised.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
we had some. Go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you for your presentation. It was very extremely interesting. And this is my question. It's pretty close to other question, but let me ask you. For the last 10 years, I've been working in the Ukraine in the energy company, and I worked with a lot of regions. So I have some information about it. And I remember well that back in 2014, when the first Russian invasion of Ukraine began, several Russian propaganda sites, apparently prepared in advance, I think, visually marked the place where they planned to post news from the new territory entity, Malorussia, which included not only Crimea and Eastern Ukraine, but also Zaporizhia, Kherson, Kharkiv, and also. I mean that even in 2014, Russia plans to occupy all this territory, which Russia did later on. My question, considering what you said earlier, beside the obvious task of Russia, what hidden or not obvious goals could Russia set for itself in February? And what goals will Russia pursue in the future? Because we can understand some obvious things, but maybe we don't understand something else.
So first I want to go to the Novorossiya. You know, the 2014, there were a lot of different visions about what the future should look like. And you'll always get that in a given population. In 2013, for example, before this war started, before the chaos of before Maidan, you could get a good variety of potential outcomes or potential futures in Ukrainian population or elsewhere. So there is a group, an element of the Russian society that wants to go back, you know, way back to the 19th century, you know, when it was pulling, you know, there are cultural lines, as you know, many different kinds of cultural zones or lines within Ukraine, or even within Russia or the former Soviet space. I'm not answering the second part of your question. I'd like you to re-ask that.
I mean that we didn't know some plans Russia in 2014, and we realized it after. Maybe before February, Russia had some hidden plans, hidden goals, which we don't understand right now. Can you tell something about it?
Well, I mean, there were some that were just overt before the war broke out in November. The Kremlin essentially demanded NATO rollback, the removal of any foreign forces from Ukraine, especially U.S. Things that were, obvious non-starters. Look, this war has gone terribly for the Kremlin and for Russians. It's a disaster for a isolated leadership, not wackos on the right, or extremists, or and you'll find them more on the right maybe than on the left in Russia. But they were always held at arm's length from power or influence. Why Dugin was car bombed? That boggles my mind. I don't understand that. But for those that prepared and then prosecuted this war, they thought it was going to last less than a week. It has lasted many months at the cost of shattering Russia's special forces capability, of losing a flagship for the Navy, of losing tens of thousands dead and more tens of thousands injured. The little countryside newspapers and television stations filled with funerals may not have made the national news, but there are these points of impact all over the country. I don't see any grand plan that has survived this. Even those that would shove Shoigu or even Putin himself aside. And the failure in Ukraine, ultimately the person bears ultimate responsibility is Putin. And so far, there were only a few on the fringe that would mention Putin by name as being responsible for this fiasco. And by any measure, that's what it is, a catastrophe for Russians, let alone for Ukrainians, but for Russians. It's ruined Russian credibility in Central Asia. It's thrown quietly into question an aspect of the strategic relationship between China and Russia as it ties in with Central Asia. At the last Shanghai Cooperation Organization meeting that was in Samarkand a month ago or so, the Chinese openly stated to do not interfere with the independence of Kazakhstan. And actually, I saw Kazakhstan as the most likely candidate for if the operation in Ukraine had been successful, Kazakhstan was next, or perhaps Kyrgyzia. But the Chinese have made it clear that Kazakhstan is to remain an independent, unmolested state. And you know, there's some gremlins that have crept in here, and if there was a little bit more creativity out of DC, that would cause some additional space to develop between the Chinese and the Russians. I don't see where the Russians benefit anywhere out of this. And what's happening for months now is redefining what success is. You know, and after a while, you start running out of reasonably intelligent or plausible suggestions of what success is. Well, you know, that's what it was last week or last month, to be generous. And I don't see the Russian public being particularly interested in. Let me put it differently. Before the war, for many years in polling of what Russians fear and don't fear, nuclear war was at the top of the list, and they were expecting a great power conflict. I mean, that's really what the Russian public was immense, just this deep fear that that's where things were headed and that they would be involved. It's not something that the public wants. Somebody asked something about the potential for Putin to be removed, say, by a velvet revolution or something of that matter. I actually think using nuclear weapons opens some very dangerous doors inside Russia, not only with the public but also with the military. You know, I probably have, your question is, you can do a whole symposium on it. And it matters. Thank you for the opportunity. Thank you all for your patience and for your questions. Thank you.